The Great Reset has occurred. I have officially restarted my Obsidian Vault. I started my Slipbox completely over from scratch. I've started to port over some of those notes from this current vault here that you see, but I've completely changed the way that I do two things. One, the way that I take permanent notes, and two, the way that I begin sequences. Before I show you the new method and how I've adopted Para into my Obsidian Vault, I want to show you how I used to connect notes. So I used to create this hierarchy. I'll just say hierarchy. So hierarchy of different notes. So whenever I'd add something in, I'd have to figure out where it fit, which was useful, but it caused a lot of friction, and it was the number one stumbling block that people would encounter when I would show them what I'm doing in Obsidian. And it worked really well because it gave a knowledge a place to get to, and I could get back to it. But when I took a step back, I realized that it didn't add a ton of value to have this hierarchy, and it's actually not what the Smart Notes is about. It's about linking them and letting kind of the structure emerge bottom up. And it's taking me good, 8 months to figure out what that meant, and I'm still working through it. But what it used to look like is I would take a note, say something on Golang, because that's a language that I'm learning, and then I would take some time and I'd think, okay, well, how does this relate? I don't have this information in my knowledge base at all. So I would think and I'd play around. I'm like, oh, it's a language, but a language is actually part of, programming, and programming is part of computer science. And that's what I would do. I would build out this hierarchy, somewhat unnecessarily, just so I had a place for the knowledge to go. And this is very similar. This is nothing different than if we were to try to categorize everything with tags or with folders. And unfortunately for me, I started to do that with inside my Smart Notes as well. So what it would look like is I'd have this top level note of computer science, which you can see here. That would then create this other note here, programming. So then in programming, I would have all these other notes, one being languages and then other of like concepts of programming, which is somewhat useful. And categorizing, but it doesn't add a ton of value to the notes, and it adds friction and time and cost of taking notes if I have to figure all this out all the time. And then eventually I would get to the Golang note. And then another thing that I realized in how I was using Smart Notes is I started to turn, so if we just open this up and close this one out so we can see it, I started to turn these into kind of like project notes, more or less, where this is supposed to be a Smart Note where, this is kind of the abstract of what Golang, what I've learned about it so far. But if we expand this, there's all these links and things that I have found along the way that I've learned. And here are actually my Smart Notes, my notes on Golang itself. But I found all these interesting links. And someone recommended that I check out Para, and I'm very reluctant to kind of dive into more productivity systems, but what I'm finding is Obsidian is kind of this nice tool that you can implement almost every productivity system known to man in there and kind of chain them together. And what's different about Obsidian is it allows you to create feedback loops between the different systems. So your Para can feed Smart Notes, your Smart Notes can feed Para, and your time blocking can kind of fit it all together. And that's what I'm going to show you now, is how I've combined Para with time blocking and Smart Notes to create something that's working rather well for me. So here's my new vault. So how I did this is my Obsidian Vault is all backed by GitHub. It's a private GitHub repository. And so I just created a branch inside of Git to be able to basically reset the vault. And what I did was I created a new branch. I deleted my Slipbox. And what you were seeing prior was a downloaded zip file of the main branch, which was my old version. So now I have this kind of new playground where I can make all the changes that I want, and when I'm happy with it, I can merge it back into the main branch and then kind of reset from there. If that's beyond the scope of what you want to do, you basically just create a new folder and copy over what notes that you want. If you don't want to learn Git or take the time to learn that, because if you're not in software development in any way, it's kind of I wouldn't advise it. Git will make you cry the first couple hours, days rather, that you learn it. Anyway. What I've begun to do here is the biggest difference from a structure standpoint is this Para method. So Para stands for projects, areas, it's an acronym, resources, and archive. And so the theory is that you have these different areas of content. Then your digital organization is really what Para is about. It's to organize your digital life. And there's 4 main areas. There's the projects that you're currently working on. And if I expand that, I have 2 active projects. I'm working on a book, Reclaim, that I frequently talk about because it's taken me a long time. And I've learned a lot in the process. And then I also have a note for work. And so if we look at this, these are what I call project notes, and what SmartNotes refers to as project notes. And this is what they look like to me. This is a manuscript project note. There's many different types of project notes, as you can imagine. They can be project management, or in this case, a manuscript or an outline, and I'll show you that in a second. So here's, I have everything outlined into parts. And if we look at my outline schedule here, minimize this, you can see that I have the headings are outlining the different parts of the book. And so I can kind of browse to that. And these link to permanent notes that right now don't exist because I deleted them. Some of them do, but it's a way that I'm using to outline the book that I'm writing and to have the Slipbox feed in ideas into my writing. I do the same thing for work. So I had an assignment to write an article about using the Azure SDK for Go using a service principal. And so I didn't know anything about Go, and I don't know much about an SDK other than what it stands for, Software Development Kit. So I had a lot of learning to do, but it resulted in all these notes, and you can see that I'm using this note as an outline to also capture the artifacts. So here was an example of the same thing being done in Java, which was very useful reference for me to write. And then here are all the resources that I use to complete this project. But most importantly, here are all the SmartNote links for the different sections of this article that I'm going to write. So that's the project note and the project area in Para. Now I also have a drafts folder because the whole benefit of SmartNotes is you get to work on multiple manuscripts at once. And so I have an essay I'm working on called Learn to Write Fast, another book manuscript called Systems of Productivity, a video course hopefully will be Take SmartNotes and Obsidian that I'm working on. And so just as I come across knowledge in SmartNotes that I know fits in here, I just link it in here. So if you look at Learn to Write Fast, here are some permanent notes that I've linked in here and ideas that I've thrown into this particular outline. So that's the drafts. The area I haven't found a good use for, it's kind of like your areas of responsibility. So one of mine is this area, this content space that I took over for work, which is Go on Azure. And so I'm just kind of combining a bunch of different things, bookmarks and a backlog of ideas, and just different research points that I found. One is from the Stack Overflow Developer Survey, which gave me a really good understanding of like what things people do with Go, what different technologies interact with it and so forth. And then one obviously for the newsletter that I run. And I haven't really flushed that out too much, but resources has been very interesting and promising. So resources is defined as like an ongoing area of interest, and it clicked to me or occurred to me the other day that this is really an index. So you have different areas. For me, I have content development, which is my discipline now, and there's several nodes in here that are useful that I constantly refer into my technical writing. One of them is Bloom's taxonomy, is basically like how you can help bring a learner up into their understanding of a particular topic and yourself, which is interesting. I have this one that I refer to every time I write an article, which is basically a cheat sheet and summarization of a bunch of notes that I've taken with SmartNotes. And so Para gives me a way not only to organize my information, but it also gives me a way to store artifacts that I create from the knowledge that I've acquired while taking SmartNotes. Because not everything is going to be a published artifact, and not everybody wants to put everything they learn out online. Like this in particular, I don't know how valuable that would be to people that aren't in content. So then I also have one for productivity and programming. So here's now that hub note that you saw for Golang has now turned into a resource note, or underneath this resource section in Para, very similar. Has the learning queue and it has the explanation, but then it has topics, and these topics are actually the entry point into sequences now. in the Slipbox. And then psychology too, or behavioral psychology, and I said that right on the first try. I'm very proud of that. I struggle with that word. Now links to these general high-level notes on information overload and ego depletion. Now, in the past, what I would have done is figured out where in psychology should I link this and build this hierarchy. And instead, I'm adopting more of like a Freiman approach, where you just pick an area of interest and you start digging in. And that has led to some really interesting connections in my Slipbox, which I'll show you in just a moment. But archive is just where you put things that are done, whether it be a project, an area of, like, you change jobs and now you're no longer a sysadmin, you're a content developer like I am. You would kind of bundle your sysadmin stuff and you put it into the archive if that was necessary. And then the planner stayed the same. Planner's where I do all my time blocking. I mentioned that and go into detail on that in a different video. But I use a number of Obsidian plugins to give me a time schedule. And if you want to look at, we can just show you what the template looks like for that right now. But this is how I plan my days and so forth. But this is really the flywheel, the start of it, that allows me to capture and keep me on track with all my projects and stuff like that. And then the Slipbox is where all the sequences go. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So in here, you can see that there's these, instead of building this hierarchy now, I just start with something that I'm interested in or a problem that I'm trying to solve. So you can see the start of these sequences. One is Smart Notes. So I had this need to take better notes, and Smart Notes has kind of struck that chord for me. And so I started to take all these very meta notes on Smart Notes. And you can see that they're starting to spiral out. And then Smart Notes led me to knowledge management, which then led me to Obsidian. And so now I have my learning, like my organic learning path is starting to map out in my notes, which is way more useful than the hierarchy. And it alleviates the burden of having to figure out where these fit perfectly into this catalog system of knowledge, which isn't even really the point. Now, if we go over to something like the technical path that I've been working on. So I had an assignment, completely switched over to disciplines from doing Terraform and Ansible to doing, and more DevOps stuff, to doing Golang and writing Golang content. I don't know Golang. I've not been a software developer in the past. I've written plenty of code, but not in the application development sense. And so I had this entry point into using the Go SDK for authentication, because those are the articles that I had to write. And now you can see that learning about that led to the default credential, and the default credential led to learning about environment variables and how to create a service principal, what a service principal is, and so forth. And now if I were to go and switch over to Python or something like that, I can reuse this knowledge because it uses the same credential types, it uses the same service principles, and I'd be able to link those notes together. And you can see that here in this, it's like behavioral psychology branch that you see here. So right in the middle, we have that resource note, or what would be referred to in Smart Notes as an index. So this behavioral psychology has two links to it. It has the ego depletion and it has the information overload. These are both ideas that I investigated and started to read research papers on for the writing of Reclaim. Now what's super interesting here is that these two now are connected, and I have this index, but it just occurred to me today when I was working and I was reading about, I think I was still reading about information overload, and it was the types. So if we open up this note and do it in preview, these are basically the ways in which people adapt or respond to information overload. There's a number of productive ways and a number of unproductive ways. And one of them is a hoarder, which just accumulates knowledge for the sake of information's sake. And that reminded me of a note that I had taken in my previous Slipbox that I moved over, called the collector's fallacy. And that's basically saying that, that people have this tendency to collect information and never do anything with it, and that it eventually overburdens them. But we do it because it closes a short zygonic loop that allows us to mentally shelf an idea, and it makes us feel like we're not losing the knowledge. And so I moved that over into my Slipbox, And I won't add a sequence to this just so you can see how it connects. But if we move that back to the slip box so my graph will pull it in, we can now see, I think I have to add it to, so Obsidian, and how I actually came across this collector's fallacy was when I was reading about SmartNotes. And so I might have just come in here and gone collector's fallacy, because this is a reason why you do SmartNotes. It makes you slow down. And so it's relevant to this entry point of knowledge, this sequence, because I started learning about SmartNotes. And as I learned about SmartNotes, I discovered this thing called the collector's fallacy. But now, if we go back to the graph, because I connected it to this types of information, I have this tie from SmartNotes to the collector's fallacy to the response types of information overload, and that will go all the way back to behavioral psychology. So now this is super interesting, because if I'm writing about information overload, I now have another note to talk about, which is like, what can you kind of do, or what is a good way to articulate information overload? And the collector's fallacy is one of those things, where information overload is actually the reason for collector's fallacy. And so that can combine to make an interesting idea that is worth writing about. And this is much more valuable than that hierarchy that I had created prior. And it makes it a lot easier, because when you take notes in these sequences, these numbers, they're locally relevant to the sequence itself. So ego depletion was the entry note that sparked my interest, that I started to read a research paper for. And 3A, I learned about executive function in the brain, and then resisting temptations. Those are directly related to ego depletion, but they might also tie into other things as I go along. But I don't need to worry about that until I've written about that and I'm starting to create links. The sequences, I do think, are still valuable. Some people think that you could discount them, but I like the categorization because it helps me visually, and then also just to catalog the knowledge in a sequence. Last thing that I'll touch on is time blocking. So if I open up my daily note here, so I also have this calendar plugin that allows me to switch through my days pretty easy. Today is the 26th, and so if we go through here, what is different is I'm no longer afraid to link to my project notes. Before, I didn't want to do this because it kind of gumped up my graph, where I'd have all these links to the different days that I did things, and that didn't help me browse my knowledge. But since I learned how to query inside the graph, which I'll show you in a second, I've stopped doing that, where I can do this. So instead now, as I'm going through my planner, I actually just link the project note that I'm doing. So it's easy to click in there and I don't have to search for it. And then I can also do fleeting notes. So an interesting point, and I think this is going to be a very pivotal thing for my knowledge management, is to use the Freiman technique. This was brought up to me from a colleague, Jess Johnson, and she brought me onto this technique, and she started to write her notes a little bit differently, where there's the theory and then there's the practice, and then you follow an interest and solve a problem and dig deeper into that problem. And I think that's how you can begin sequences in SmartNotes, because they say to follow your interest. That's not very applicable to me, but the Freiman technique is very applicable. Now, I haven't turned this into a permanent note yet, and I haven't even started a literature note because there's so many over there. And so instead I've started to create fleeting notes inside my planner. So if we look at this, this is just a combination of links, and it's a reminder for me to explore what this technique is and to learn about it, and hopefully some artifact. I'll create my own permanent note on the Freiman technique that I'll link into my SmartNotes, because I see it directly relating to how you would write and pursue permanent notes and sequences. But as far as organization is concerned, what I do is I create those cards, and I just throw them in my planner. And this is something that I never open this folder. I either browse through the days to the notes, or I use a search, and I can remember the keywords. But I throw them in here, and I have notes from a virtual coffee that I had the other day, notes on Clear Technical Writing, which is a book I'm reading, and Para itself. So that was just an idea I had in here, and I want to create a permanent note on Para. And so I start a fleeting note, and I put all my resources in there, and then eventually it culminates into something useful that I can put into the Slipbox. But that's how I kind of run my days. Also with the productivity planner, where I have the time blocking schedule, block all my time off in hours of either typically an hour or 30 minutes. And then I use these two sections here as a scratch space to store ideas and different things, and to populate reading lists that are part of that resource note. So I hope you found that was helpful. This has been a lot of learning for me and a complete shift in how I manage my Obsidian Vault, but it's become tremendously useful, and I'm sure that my understanding will continue to evolve, but I wanted to share as I learn. So again, I hope you found this was useful. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. I almost forgot to show you the query. So in the graph view, you can actually use filters to determine where you want your graph to look as far as notes. And so because my indexes are in my resource folder and all my permanent notes are in my Slipbox, I want just those two folders, and that way I can kind of sort out all the day-to-day linkage between the project notes and my planner. And so if you look in here, I have path Slipbox or path to the 3 resources, my resources folder. So that way, that is how I am getting these, where did it go? Behavioral psychology index in there, as well as the Golang one that is in there as well. But that is how you can just pare down your graph to just a couple folders. So yeah, thanks for watching.